Today, Alexandra is joined by two food system policy experts, Tristan Quinn-Thibodeau and Alberta Guerra, to talk over some of the terminology and policy priorities involved in the global response to the environmental crises we've been considering, from biodiversity loss and ecological disruption to global heating. Tristan and Alberta are both from ActionAid, an international network seeking to build a more just, equitable and sustainable world. We're hugely grateful to them for making time to join the podcast near Baltimore, USA and Rome, Italy. To start with, the discussion focuses on COP26 and its legacy. If you're looking for a quick summary of some of the hits and misses of that COP, we think you'll enjoy this episode. But quite quickly it expands beyond that to actually touch on almost all of the areas we've looked at so far in this series. Tristan and Alberta have a particular perspective on the profit with the spectrum that many listeners will agree with and many won't. But whatever your view, we know you'll find their joined up thinking invaluable in getting an overview of current policy priorities. And in the interest of jargon busting, another way of saying that is getting an overview of exactly how we're tackling producing food sustainably to support life on Earth, including ourselves.
Good morning and good afternoon to you, Tristan, and to you, Alberta. Thank you so much for joining us on the podcast. It's a real pleasure to have you from across the Atlantic on both sides. And we traditionally begin this podcast by asking our guests to briefly introduce themselves, to tell us what they do, but also tell us why they do what they do. Tristan, do you want to get us started?
Sure, yeah. Thank you so much, Alexandra, for inviting us to this podcast. My name is Tristan Quinn-Thibodeau, and I am the national campaigner at ActionAid USA, which is based in Washington, D.C., and is part of ActionAid International, which is a international human rights and international development NGO in over 50 countries, I think. And what I do is I build coalitions for grassroots power to advance policies to support the right to food and the right to land, and also to counter what we call false solutions to the climate crisis in the food and agriculture sector. And for us at ActionAid USA, and for me in particular, that work really began and has centered around the biofuel boom of about 15 years ago. And now we're seeing that many of the lessons we hoped folks would learn from that policy and program are not being learned as we move forward. And why do I do this work? Well, I think it's because the community I grew up in southern Maine, which is in the northeastern U.S., was a community that valued local farming, had a lot of small farms, protected small farms from development, and it was a really great life. And then as I've explored more parts of the world, I realized that's still the majority, the way that the majority of the people around the world get their food, but it's disappearing. It's being displaced by large factory farms, large industrial farms. And I think we have to preserve that. And also, I think there's really no more important work today than trying to figure out and repair the relationship between humans and the natural world. And our agricultural systems are really what defines that relation.
Thank you so much, Tristan. I really hope we're going to get a chance to dive into that deeper philosophical dimension. Alberta Guerra, you are talking to us from the countryside nearby Rome. Do you want to tell us a little bit about what you do and why you do it?
Yes, for sure. And thank you for inviting us in this podcast. So starting with my name, yes, my name is Alberta Guerra. I work as a senior policy analyst at ActionAid USA together with Tristan. And my work is around doing global advocacy on global food policies to basically contribute to increase quantity and quality of public investments in agriculture, with a particular focus on women, rural farmers, agroecology, right to food, and food sovereignty. As you were rightly saying, I mean, I come from Rome, but I live in the countryside now in a little farm. And but I continue, of course, to be attached to Rome and to go there for meetings. Also, because part of my work is also to act as a liaison between the ActionAid International Federation and the UN Rome Food Agencies, together with the Committee on World Food Security. So at the same time, I also sit at the Global Agricultural Food Security Program, which is hosted in Washington, steering committee as a CSO representative. So speaking from the countryside, from a small farm, I really feel the rights of people that produce most of the food that we eat as central in my work. So my work is mostly about how to put the rights of these people at the center of global food policies. In addition to that, I think that I do this work because I believe that we are all part of the same ecosystem and nature is not something that is separate from us. During my 15 years of working with indigenous people, community-based organizations, particularly in developing countries, I've seen most of them as Moscow food producers, indigenous peoples, women, farmers getting their livelihoods from farming while protecting the environment. And I strongly believe that this is the model that we have to preserve in the north and in the south. So I think that defending the rights of these people is absolutely paramount for my work, and I think that it's absolutely important to live in a planet where natural resources are protected, rural areas are vibrant, consumers can access healthy diets, and producers can live from their farming.
Thank you so much, Alberta. We reached out to the both of you because you wrote this article, a blog post, reacting to a project launched by the Biden administration at the COP, which is called Agricultural Innovation Mission for Climate. And you wrote a reaction to this project that has been quite poorly mediatized. And because at Prophets and Wizards, we're talking about the biodiversity crisis in the European space, and we're linking it directly to food systems, and we're talking about climate in relation to food systems. And because we really wanted to talk about what happened at the COP in relation to food systems, we thought it would be worthwhile to really shed light on this Biden administration project and what it means. But just to zoom out a little bit before we dive into the Aim for Climate initiative, I would just like to know what you guys felt coming out of the COP26. I was wondering whether you had hopes, fears, and anger coming out of it when you consider what happened during COP26.
Yeah, well, I can start. I think, well, just to say, Alberta and I were not at the COP, but we were following it from afar, and we did have colleagues from ActionAid that were there. And from what we can tell, COP26 was a failure in many ways. It did not deliver on a real path to 1.5 degrees warming, despite what the slogan of Keep 1.5 Alive, despite what that slogan says. It also failed to deliver a financing mechanism for the rich countries to fund the development of poor countries without, using fossil fuels. And it failed to deliver any kind of financial support for loss and damage, for the people, for the countries suffering the first impacts of the climate crisis, but, who by and large are the people who had really nothing to do with creating the crisis. And so on those three fronts, or those three issues, the COP26 was a failure. And I think, coming from the United States, so I'm calling from Baltimore, Maryland, which is just outside of Washington, D.C., the U.S. government was a major obstacle on all of those issues. I think, though, at the same time, there is a lot of hope coming out from the COP26, not because of government action, but because of the action of people inside and outside the COP, and a growing realization that this is an urgent issue. Big transformation is needed. And also, we're not going to get climate action without climate justice, that there needs to be fairness and equity for the people suffering worst and first and who had nothing to do with creating the crisis, and the people, the countries who did create the crisis, coming from the United States, coming from Europe, historically, our economic development has created the crisis. We're going to have to do more. We have to do our fair share. So I think it's a complicated mixed bag coming out of COP26, but certainly the fight is not over.
What you're saying is really reminiscent of what I heard Some people from the Climate Action Network say that they left wondering whether they should be celebrating the breadcrumbs or shouting for more action. We really get this general sense, but somehow when we think about the COP26 and we think about climate action, we don't necessarily think food systems. Alberta, what kind of place did sustainable food systems hold within the COP?
Well, we can start by locating the COP26 right after the UN Food System Summit that took place in September. Just to let you know that ActionAid was part of the broader coalition boycotting the summit because of the several problems coming up with the structure and the way it was defined. But I think that one of the positive things, the only positive things maybe of the UN Food System Summit, was that it was able to shed light on the need to transform the food system, having climate concern in mind. So locating the COP26 after the UN Food System Summit means that we had big expectations that also the COP addressed the issue of how to transform the current food system, which is no longer sustainable, in order to meet and to contribute to climate change adaptation and mitigation. But this didn't happen, and it's really strange that this didn't happen if you consider that the agricultural sector is responsible for at least 1/3 of global greenhouse gas emission, and at the same time it is heavily affected by climate change impacts. So the fact that agriculture and food system transformation didn't feature so prominently in the COP26 is something that we really need to be aware of and consider, because it's really a shortfall of the COP26 to not have addressed issues like livestock sector, factory farming, and large-scale industrial agriculture, which again are the major responsible of the green gas emissions that we are seeing today.
Yeah, as you say, Alberta, it's strange. I mean, farming and food systems is a topic that was, at the end of the day, maybe we can say relatively absent from the COP26 discussions. You know, we noticed that during the 2 weeks of the conference, whole days were allocated to themes like finance, energy, and transport, maybe without surprise, but there was no dedicated day for agriculture and food systems. Farming did fall under one of the days, and that was Nature Day on the Saturday. Where there was a lot of talk about protecting forests. And so this kind of theme at the nexus between deforestation and industrial agriculture. Maybe a little bit about cutting meat consumption, food waste, and so on. But how can we understand this mystery? How, on the back of the UN Food Summit, would there be not a whole day dedicated to farming?
That's a really good question. There might be several reasons. From my perspective, what I can see is that there is a lot of resistance to seriously address the contribution of the agricultural sector to climate change. Even if we have now a lot of evidence, UN official research that speak to that and call for radical change. I think that probably one aspect is the big resistance from big corporations that have vested interest in protecting the current model, as they control between 60-70% of the global seed, pesticides, and fertilizer markets. And of course, addressing the transformation that we need will need to completely change the system, and they will lose their profit, of course. But I think that some resistance comes, of course, also from big exporter countries, because they do not want to reform their intensive production system, which is at the basis of their economy. I probably would add that there is also a tendency to fragment the issues. So even if the nexus between climate and food for us is clear, this is not yet very clear to many. And even in the UN, you have different spaces, different domains where food and climate are respectively addressed. But there is still a lot of problems in making this nexus and try to address everything as interconnected, all the crises are connected, so addressing the root causes of all the multiple crises that we are going through. So I think that also the the working silos might be another explanation of why that was not possible to address these issues so seriously in COP.
Yet, Alberta, as you say, food systems, especially when we include processing, packaging, and transports, are responsible for at least 1/3 of global greenhouse gas emissions. Tristan, do you want to walk us through some of the key ways that we can understand this impact of our agri-food systems on the climate?
Sure. Yeah, I can. And I also wanted to go back to that last question because I think a lot about this issue of how to transition the agricultural system to be, zero carbon, and why it's different than transitioning the energy system. And I think it's because when we talk about energy, getting off of fossil fuels, getting onto renewable energy sources, it's just input substitution. You have to change the infrastructure to accommodate the different energy input, but it's just input substitution. But when we're talking about transitioning agriculture, it's much different. It's a complete reorientation of the way we relate to nature, which is what I said at the beginning of this interview. And I think one thing that I forgot to mention that is important about COP26 was that agroecology was mentioned or included in the official negotiating text for the first time at a COP. Granted, it's in brackets, which means that it's not officially in the document. It's just a note that it's being discussed. But that is really substantial because agroecology is a complete paradigm shift away from the industrial ag extractive globalized model. And I think the introduction of agroecology and the support of many governments for it could really create a different dynamic in COPs coming, future COPs. But in terms of the impact of our industrialized food system on the climate, I think, I've seen estimates, and estimates vary, but I've seen some estimates that, half of all emissions come from the food system. And that's when you count, all emissions from supermarkets, all emissions from trucking related to food transport and all kinds of other things. So I think that's not the usual way in which greenhouse gas emissions are tracked. But I think that is important to note that this sector, this aspect of our lives and of our economy is super important. And I think the two big ways in which the industrial ag sector contributes to climate change is one through deforestation and land use change related to expansion of agribusiness production, because you cut down trees and destroy ecosystems, you not only lose a carbon sink, but you release a lot of carbon, and then you're not doing some kind of ecological farming on top of it. You're doing a monocrop usually, which uses chemicals and doesn't really build soil health and all kinds of other things. And then the other major impact is factory farmed meat and livestock production. And I think specifically with factory farming for livestock production, an analysis from the organizations GRAIN and the Institute for Agricultural and Trade Policy from a few years ago found that the largest meat corporations produce as much greenhouse gas emissions as some of the major fossil fuel companies, and that the top 20 meat and dairy companies produce more greenhouse gas emissions than Germany, Canada, Australia, the UK, and France combined. So, and I think other analysis has said that even if we were able to, say, phase out fossil fuels rapidly, like within the next, within the decade or something, if we don't handle emissions from the food system or from the food sector, we're still going to cross that 1.5 degree threshold. So it's absolutely imperative that we deal with this issue.
Before I ask Alberta if she wants to add anything to that in our way of understanding the nexus between climate and our agri-food systems, I'm curious, Tristan, where did agroecology come into the COP text?
So from what I understand, at the COP, there are the official negotiations, but then there are also these workshops where I believe governments, but also, civil society organizations can discuss the issues. And they're officially part of the negotiations. I don't think they're like side events, but that is where agroecology first was sort of introduced to the COP. And then I'm not sure how it entered into the negotiating text. I know that one of the sort of contradictions, I suppose, is that I believe it was India that, many countries opposed agroecology in particular. The United States is very opposed to agroecology in other UN spaces, but in particular, India objected to it being formally included in the text. Even though there's a very strong movement for agroecology in India, they call it zero budget natural farming. So it's something that's interesting because there could be a lot of support for agroecology from that country of over 1 billion people. So that's part of the dynamic at the COP, and something I think that it's a dynamic we need to pay attention to moving forward.
Thank you, Tristan. And I just wanted to give you a chance, Alberta, to add anything that you may want to in relation to this kind of energy-intensive agri-food system. How can we better understand the consequences of the food that we're producing this way?
Tristan gave a really exhaustive overview of the connection between some agricultural practices and climate change, putting the attention on deforestation and livestock factory farming. I would just like to add that we can't ignore the massive use of pesticides and fertilizers that all this large-scale intensive agricultural production model requires. So, of course, this is another major contribution to greenhouse emissions, and of course, one of the strongest call for food movements, civil society engaged in the food space is exactly to not optimize, neither maximize the use of these pesticides and fertilizers, but just to agree on a common framework to completely eliminate the use of these agrochemicals in agriculture. They are responsible for emissions because they are very energy intensive in the production. They require the burning of fossil fuels, but they're also responsible for biodiversity loss, impoverishment of the soil with its water retention capacity. So really one of the structural changes that we need to do in the agricultural sector. So we can't ignore the contribution of the massive use of pesticides and fertilizers to greenhouse gas emissions. If we look at the fact that to prepare them, there is requested a lot of burning of fossil fuels, but also the use of pesticides and fertilizers are responsible for biodiversity loss, impoverishment of the soil and its water retention capacity, so exacerbating basically the effect on climate. So this is really something that we really need to change and phase out completely.
So just before we move on to speak more in depth about the US's Aim for Climate pledge, maybe we can talk about the kinds of pledges and announcements and outcome related to food systems.
Sure. So the Agriculture Innovation Mission for Climate was an initiative that was, launched by the United States government and the United Arab Emirates, and it was a pledge for, $4 billion for research into innovation to help food systems adapt to the climate crisis and to reduce emissions in the food and agriculture sector, and with a heavy emphasis on technology, so developing new technologies to allow the industrial food system to emit less. And I think there's a strong emphasis on technologies like data and AI and other kinds of mechanization, artificial intelligence. They're very expensive, and they're really only applicable to large-scale, capital-intensive food systems, whereas the majority of the world is still the majority of the world's farmers are small scale, have very little money, and need low cost innovations, not the kinds that are coming from this AIM for climate initiative. I think if you go to the website, it's instructive what that vision looks like. There's a big monoculture field with a large irrigation rig. That's pretty standard, but that shows, that the industrial monocrop model is at the center of what they want to maintain. But in addition to that, there are other photos of a massive warehouse-sized greenhouse with you can see there's precision irrigation. There are robots going up and down the rows, picking and tending to the crops. And then further down on their website, there's another image of a farmer, but it looks like a professional manager with an iPad or with some tablet, managing or looking at data, controlling a drone. It's this AI, artificial intelligence, big data, robotic, climate-controlled food production model that they are interested in, and that that is their vision. And it is, as some people have said, farming without farmers. It is agriculture completely disconnected from nature, in my view. And I think that it is a vision that may be very popular, maybe very maybe a desired vision for people living in cities, for people who have money living in cities. But for people living in the countryside, it's a dead end, or it's a sign that their livelihoods, their ways of living are coming to an end. There's not really any, there's no people in these pictures. And so I don't know how people are going to live in the countryside anymore. And at a time when we need to be getting back to the countryside in order to heal this division and all the extraction we've done to the natural world, I just don't understand this vision, to be honest with you.
Alberta, before we really dive further deep into this kind of proposal of a new agricultural industrial system, do you want to tell us if anything else happened in relation to forests and land use or transition to sustainable foods and agriculture?
First, let me start with a very personal impression. When we had ActionAid colleagues at the COP, as you know, but of course, all those not being there used to follow through media or through the website what is going on. So my initial reflection is that when I looked for the final outcome of the COP, I got lost because there were plenty of announcements and declarations, even related to food, that it was really difficult to scrutinize all of them in detail, even for those that were at the COP and so got the announcement really in real time. So as I was saying, there are plenty of announcements and declarations. So when it comes to land, in particular to land and forests, there were declarations that were made by leaders. There is the Glasgow Leader Declaration on Forest and Land Use. There was a COP20C IPCC Forest Tenure Joint Donor Statement. There was another Glasgow Innovation Breakthrough in Agriculture. So I can mention all of them. There are around 5 or 6, including the aim for climate. But what struck me more is that all of these announcements and declarations share some common elements that for me are very worrying. So first, they are not at all binding. They are very general declaration, don't have time-bound work plans, concrete activities. And of course, one of the things that is worth noticing is that they are not negotiated outcome. So this means that they lack completely any kind of accountability mechanism. They are just general declaration without serious commitments by governments, many times accompanied also by corporate sector joining these initiatives, but nothing more than words. Another element that struck my attention was the concept of nature that they used to use. Nature not really as a public good per se, but mostly as a mean to achieve the mitigation targets that they claim to achieve, basically working as a carbon sink. This is particularly for land and forest. And this has really serious concern. First, because it doesn't address the root causes of emissions. but just to use, the offset as a mechanism to try to address and to achieve mitigation target. Second element is that considering the mostly land and forest as a carbon sink, they will not look at paying attention to the rights of the people living on that land, indigenous peoples, grassroots communities. What about them? I mean, if land has to be used as a carbon sink, but what about the rights of the people that live on that land? Another element, again, if we look particularly at the declaration on land use and forest, is that it's not even realistic what they plan to do, because the land required to offset all the emissions, it's simply the planet, it's not enough. The planet doesn't have so much land to achieve this goal. And maybe the last element that I would like to highlight is that this is something that we also addressed in other spaces, particularly in the Committee of War, Food Security, in the FAO. I mean, what the definition of forest? The definition of forest is very broad and ended up including also soy and oil palm plantations or tree plantations. And again, this is not exactly the concept of forest that we draw from indigenous peoples and communities living in that forest.
Yeah, I think in general, I think what the point that Alberta made, that it was very hard to figure out what was the actual outcome of the COP when we saw this plethora of pledges announced. And in our view, all of these pledges from governments, from corporations that were outside of the official COP process, or at least tangential to it, they were distractions from the fact that the actual policies, the actual language being negotiated was far less than what we need. They were distractions, and they also focused on this concept of net zero by 2050, which may sound good. I mean, that is what the IPCC recommended, said that we need to hit net zero by 2050, but they also said we need to essentially cut global emissions in half in almost 8 years now, on the way to net zero by 2050. But what many of these pledges are about, these net zero pledges, they're not really about the second part, about cutting emissions in half in 8 years. They're about offsetting all emissions by 2050. And as Alberta pointed out, there is just not enough. A lot of the offset plans rely on land, which is where this agriculture and food system piece does come into the COP. It was not named explicitly, but with all the offsets involved in many of these pledges, that's where the land sector was in our land use issues. There's just not enough land for any of these, for all the offset pledges. And a lot of people maybe have not done the math, but it's just not going to work.
Yeah, I saw you say something like Shell's net zero plan would require land 3 times the size of the Netherlands. I found that so striking. Where are they going to be buying land in order to put these plans into action? And when they talk about offsetting strategy, and you also mentioned monoculture plantation of trees, Alberta, what do these look like in practice? What does it mean to use land to offset?
Very shortly, this means that you need to use the land for this purpose, but this would simply increase the pressure over land, and using as an offset and putting this into the carbon market mechanism, for example, this means also increased financialization of land resources. And again, this would harm communities and indigenous peoples living on that land, and ignore the capacity of these people to preserve their natural resources. So it's really dangerous, because what we see is that all of this will simply increase the rush for land. So will lead to increased grabbing of land and natural resources, human rights violations, especially for those most affected and the people and communities that live on that land.
I want to move on to another quite striking pledge, just because of its number, 30%. apparently the EU, the US, and other countries agreed to reduce global methane emissions by 30%. And when we talk about the agricultural sector, we immediately think about cows and manure when we think about methane, right? So I was wondering whether there was a link between this pledge to reduce global methane emissions and anything relating to reducing meat production or eating less meat. Tristan, do you have an idea of this?
Yeah, well, this pledge was a pledge between the US, the EU, and I think many other countries joined. And I can't speak exactly to what the EU, what they're going to do to implement this pledge. Excuse me. But unfortunately, the Biden administration, while they did announce new regulations on fossil fuel extraction, which also releases methane, as well as a couple other regulations on, I think, the energy sector, they only asked for voluntary commitments to climate smart agriculture as a way of reducing methane from the food system. And as we highlighted at the sort of the top of this interview, it's the factory farm livestock production model, which is manure, like you mentioned, which produces the methane that's driving the climate crisis. And methane, as you probably know, is a much more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. It stays in the atmosphere for a shorter period of time, but it actually has a stronger greenhouse effect. And so it's very troubling that the Biden administration is not taking a tougher line on factory farming. But you have to understand that the Secretary of Agriculture, Tom Vilsack, who serves in the Biden administration and also served in the Obama administration, spent the time between those two administrations as the top lobbyist for the dairy industry, which is in the United States, which is relies on this factory farm model. So I think that's a reflection of the fact that the agribusiness sector has, I don't want to say they're dictating food and agriculture policy in the U.S., but they have a strong grasp on it. And I think it's a problem. And so I think we need to push more on this methane pledge and ensure that factory farming is included in that. Now, I got to say, it's very difficult. This issue is very difficult because many farmers don't want to be hurt economically by the transition to different kind of livestock production. I mean, the prices they get paid for their product is extremely low, and until we change that whole economic model and ensure that farmers and workers in the food system have a just transition to a more sustainable, more ecological model, more fair, more just model, we're going to get a lot of resistance. So it's a very difficult sort of political project we have to undertake, but that's where it has to be.
Yes, very, very quickly, just a small addition that unfortunately what we see is also that the debate around the livestock sector is really bad shaped and leads to many misunderstandings and wrong conclusions, and ended up in just considering, okay, are we going to reduce our meat consumption? So I think that this debate has to be located in the right context, and calling for reduction of meat consumption must consider also that we have overproduction, overconsumption of meat, and a lot of consequences in terms of health. For example, increased malnutrition, obesity, not communicable disease. And so it's not just a cut in meat consumption, but it really has to be located into the right context to be adequately addressed. And at the same time, calling for better meat production means dismantling the CAFO or similar concentrated animal feeding operations, but replacing them with diversified, localized agropastoral systems that are at the core of agroecological system. And this is to protect the welfare of animals, but also the quality of the meat we eat and the health of the people. So I think the debate should be really framed in a different way, also to raise much more awareness among consumers that might appear worried to reduce their meat consumption, but they might, let's say, overlook the health implication of their choices.
this new glorious approach to agriculture as a nature-based solutions gives a lot of people some hope. Alberta or Tristan, whichever of you wants to begin, do you think it's helpful to think of agriculture as a nature-based solution? And then also, why do you think it's a popular vision and for whom?
It's important to address this term nature-based solution because it was all over COP26 and it's all over, it's mentioned many times in plans to address the climate crisis. And when the term nature-based solutions was first introduced, I think we were hopeful that it could be a concept that could advance sustainable agriculture or more ecological agriculture. But what we've seen is that the term is now just synonymous with carbon offsetting. And in that regard, it's a problematic term. And so, no, I don't think I would see, or wouldn't want to describe agriculture as a nature-based solution. Certainly, there are attempts now to make agricultural production a source of carbon credits and to try to sequester carbon in agricultural soils. This is a big effort underway, especially in the United States, but there are very serious concerns with that plan because certainly carbon can be sequestered in land, and we should certainly be farming and taking care of our land in a way to build up healthy soils and ensure carbon is stored in them. However, if we are trying to be serious about stopping this climate crisis and the worst impacts, we have to stop carbon from entering the atmosphere and then take it out for good. And if you just sequester it in soils, it can be released very easily if you just plow up the land, if there is any kind of natural disaster that happens to the land. So it's not secure or stable. And then also most of these proposals do not encompass the kind of paradigm shift of agricultural systems that we would like to see of, real agroecological production. It's still the industrial model, but with a few tweaks here and there. And so I think, yes, like as I said, it is popular with people living in cities, people who have grown accustomed to technology, to smartphones and tablets and these kinds of things, and to apps and, Uber and Lyft and these kinds of things. It's like, yes, it's magic. We can have food grown in a warehouse, and it is with no environmental negative impacts because it's totally controlled, and robots can do it. And isn't that wonderful? But of course, farmers, people living in rural areas, they don't want this vision, and it would be a real disaster, I think, economically and politically. If you look at the maps of the political maps, we haven't talked about this, but in terms of this conversation, but we're also in the middle of a political crisis, and it's frankly between people living in cities and people living in the countryside. And I think the extractive industrial model of food production is at the heart of this massive political crisis we're in, because people living in rural areas in the countryside see their entire ways, and I'm talking particularly about the global north here, see their ways of living disappearing. And there's certainly many other factors which we don't have time to go into. But if we don't address, if we continue on this path of turning rural areas into sacrifice zones, for example, where it's just about extraction and production and making those areas unlivable. And I mean, in the United States, rural towns have been completely decimated over the last 30 years. I mean, just boarded up street storefronts, just whole towns dying. There's nobody living there anymore. Schools closing, everything closing. So there's no small business left. It's this creates this deep sense of pessimism, and that is a big problem. And so this vision may be popular with, middle class, professional people living in cities, young people perhaps, but it has a huge social, political, and economic cost that we cannot sustain.
Alberta, do you want to keep opening up on this question of why are the questions of the future of agriculture so inextricably entangled with questions of social and climate justice?
Yes, if I may add something to what Tristan said on natural-based solutions would be great before going to the specific point.
Yes,
Because
go
I
for
think,
it.
yeah, thank you. Because I think that nature-based solutions are going to shape the narrative for the next decade on how to address climate change through nature and through agriculture. So I think that it's really relevant to understand very clearly what are the implications. So just to add to what Tristan said before, I mean, let's start by saying that nature-based solutions are really, it's a really vague definition. I mean, we're not clear about what it exactly entails because it doesn't give a very clear definition. So we risk to have a range of nature-linked practices that might be considered as nature-based solutions, but without qualifying what is really based on nature, on ecological principle like agroecology practices and other practices which are not and then harmful, even harmful for the environment. So the definition is very vague. The other concern I see is that, as I said before, they look at nature as instrumental to offset carbon emissions and not as a public good that we have to preserve and protect. And of course, I mean, if nature becomes instrumental to achieve this net zero target, we'll enter into a market-based mechanism, which is also the carbon market. That will lead to increased commercialization and financialization of nature, which is, again, very worrying. I think that another aspect that I would like to stress is that nature-based solutions, I think it's very attractive for particularly corporate sector because allow them to greenwash and present themselves as doing something good for the environment, but basically without changing anything in their way of production or doing their business. So again, I mean, it's a way to simply present something in a different way, but without changing and making structural reforms. And lastly, I think that again, these kind of solutions disconnect nature from the people who live in nature and completely disregard the equity and the governance dimensions, which must be at the core of any kind of transformational and real change that we want to bring about. Usually, when they refer to, they refer to innovations, we are not talking about the community-based agroecology innovations developed every day by small-scale food producers. What they refer to is the kind of innovations which are really sophisticated, high-tech solutions. And there are many of them that range from the use of drones, precision agriculture, development of very sophisticated apps that, for example, help forecast weather conditions or share market informations under the, let's say, under the objective to connect consumers and the big retailers, for example. All of these innovations, are very attractive for many because apparently they will resolve the problems, help the world keep the same habits in consumption without sacrificing anything, keep safe our let's say blind trust into progress, and looks like the golden solutions for all the problems that we are facing. Unfortunately, this is not the reality. This is not the reality, and we always have to question ourselves when it comes to technology and innovations. Who controls that? Who will benefit from that? And who can access that? Because there are huge social implications that must be brought into the discussion. Now, all these technologies are in the hands of a handful of powerful corporations that develop them and are able to use and control them. Usually, very often, all these technology solutions are very, very expensive. So too much expensive for the poor and of course, are not accessible to the millions of small-scale food producers across the world. So this means that all of these farmers will be simply left out. And what will happen is that the conversation between developed countries and developing countries around transfer of knowledge, recurring to these high-tech solutions, will end up replicating a really colonialist model of knowledge transfer, with the northern countries or the big corporate sectors selling this technology to the poorest, with all the consequences that we can also imagine in terms of falling into a dependency trap. So what do we have to ask of ourselves is what about the rights of the indigenous people, women communities that farm their land will be simply taken off their land?
Yeah, totally. And I think that that's exactly the challenge that this podcast is dealing with, is that there's a higher and higher level of recognition of the urgency of facing the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis. But these are framed as scientific problems. And so it gives to the solution this kind of sliding sense of neutrality. And the different actors can come from vastly different political and economic agendas. Maybe sometimes we manage to bring the conversation down from political cleavages when we talk simply about some of the possible climate costs. Just in pure energy terms, what does it mean to set up robotized agriculture and vertical farms and so on?
Sure, yeah. So it's a great question. And I think precision agriculture has gotten a lot of attention. And from my understanding, it's about using more advanced machinery and sensors and data to more efficiently apply chemicals to industrial food systems or industrial agriculture, with the idea that you reduce the kinds of chemicals per acre that you have to use. However, I don't know that they actually look at total amount of agrochemical use. For example, if you might reduce your per acre use, but if you're expanding the number of acres you're using chemicals on, you may actually be increasing the amount of agrochemical that you're applying. So, I don't think that the chemical companies, agrochemical companies, they're all in support of precision agriculture. So presumably they're at least assuming that they will maintain their current sales, and maybe they're going to increase their current sales. So I think if we're concerned about agrochemicals as a source of carbon emissions from the food and agriculture sector, precision agriculture is something that I don't think is a real solution, because we're looking at the per unit use of the chemical, not the total use of the chemical. And as Alberta mentioned at the beginning, we can phase out the complete use of these chemicals. We have agroecological systems and research. And agroecological research is completely underfunded. This is sort of the irony, or maybe not the irony, but the disappointment of something like AIM for Climate, Agricultural Innovation Mission for Climate. $4 billion in agroecological research, which is actually beneficial for the majority of the people, or could be used by the majority of people on Earth. That's really where that money would be amazing to go, not into more AI. The tech industry has plenty of money already to do that kind of, and agribusiness companies have plenty of money already to do that research if they want. But I think, so we have to look at that in terms of precision agriculture. I'm not sure that it's actually going to reduce overall emissions. And I did want to go back to this other point, because I'm not quite satisfied with my answer about, this vision, this tech vision for agriculture and how popular it is. I think one big factor is that many people, are living in cities in particular, are disconnected from rural areas, and even people living in rural areas are disconnected from food production, especially in the global north, because so few people do it now as farms have gotten bigger and bigger, as the market's gotten more and more concentrated. It's impossible in the United States. It's very hard to make a living as a farmer unless, particularly in, the big farming areas, unless you're farming thousands of acres. And I know it's the same in Europe as well. And so people don't really know what happens on farms, especially when it comes to meat, eggs, dairy, that kind of production. And even in the United States, there are states have passed laws forbidding people from taking photos or videos of factory farms. So the fact is, people don't even understand what is happening with their food, and they don't have any connection to the people who are producing that food. And I think so if there are people that are supportive of this vision or think that this vision is something we should aim for, it's because they're not in relation with the people who are producing foods or with rural areas. And I think the fact that we've got such, at least in the United States, have such still have such positive energy and support for things like farmers markets. I mean, most people want organic food if they can get it, shows that there actually is a real desire for agroecological food systems, even if people don't use that terminology.
Maybe I'm realizing we're going over time. There's so much great content to talk about. I am thinking of moving on to the subsidy system, and it was particularly resonant earlier, Alberta, when you were talking about basically financial visions of nature that are tied in to the nature-based solutions model. And we see these kinds of financial visions of the value add of basically regenerating ecosystems when it comes to new forms of subsidies. A recent UN report concluded that almost 90% of the $540 billion of global agricultural subsidies are given to farmers who actively destroy nature and fuel the climate crisis. And so, at least on the European scale, subsidies are one of the priorities of the elements of the agri-food sector to be reconsidered. And we're looking at new agro-environmental schemes that are looking to reward, quote-unquote, farmers for delivering public goods. That would be things like planting trees, water retention, biodiversity benefits on their farm, and it's also completely explicit in the UK's new farming policy, Environmental Land Management, ELM. What do you guys think about these new ways of thinking about agricultural incentive plans based on basically farmers as producers of biodiversity and producers of other natural benefits? Alberta, do you want to get us started?
I can start for sure, and starting by saying that it's a really tricky question because, of course, I mean, I'm perfectly aware, we all are aware that about the funding that you are mentioning, that most of the current subsidies are going to practices that basically destroy the environment and the soil. So I think that for sure it's an important step to recognize that and to shift this funding towards more sustainable practices. In terms of using these subsidies to reward farmers for producing biodiversity and provide we can call them ecosystem services. I mean, it's not totally bad because it might, of course, I mean, incentivize good practices by farmers and help them to foster and to increase diversified, more integrated farming system through, again, I mean, integrating agriculture with livestock and forestry, for example. So I think that of course, we can't be totally negative about that, but at the same time, so we also need to be aware of some concern. Well, first is that my concern is that this system will risk creating increased pressure over farmers about, again, I mean, finding the solutions, being offered the solutions to achieve mitigation targets. And this, again, can replicate the top-down model where farmers will be incentivized from the top to do something that is required at that moment in time. And in this regard, I think this approach many times risks to ignore what farmers really want and what farmers, particularly small-scale farmers, small-scale food producers from the south, are asking for. And I continue to refer to that because I know that the problems, the challenges that the farmers face in the north and the south are more and more similar. So I can see now the, let's say, the divergence between the challenges of the farmers in the north compared to the farmers in the south, as it was like 20, 30 years ago. But at the same time, so we need always to be reminded that we have to look particularly the poorest, particularly the most vulnerable, particularly those producers that represent the majority of the small-scale farmers in the world and live in rural areas in the southern countries, and represent at the same time also those that are suffering most from hunger and from the impacts of climate change. So just to be back to this, many of these farmers are asking for policies and support and financial support as well to their agroecological farming system, which are more local, which are not necessarily linked to the global market. They just want to get remunerative prices from the market, so not be monopolized or controlled by neither corporate sector, neither intermediaries, for example, particularly in the case of the southern countries. So I think that we can also look back at what these farmers, most of them are organized, are visible entities that might have a dialogue with the respective governments, respective institutions, and we need to hear what they want to get this alive for their farming. And so when I speak to them, particularly those that I used to work with who are really agroecological farmers. To be honest, I don't hear about them serving as providers of ecosystem services. I mean, they do farm in a sustainable way because they find it more productive, because they find it more sustainable, because they find it more justice in a way that they can control their production, they can control their what they want to produce. I mean, that they struggle just to access the market they need. So I think that, of course, I mean, we are part of the global call to shift subsidies and incentives from the industrial agriculture model and redirect this support towards agroecological diversified agri-food systems. But to be honest, I'm not entirely sure that's the same kind of solutions that those promoting this reward mechanism have in mind.
Tristan, would you like to comment?
Sure. Yeah, I think that this issue is really important. And coming from the United States, the analysis from the National Family Farm Coalition is that subsidies are not the driver of the industrialized food system that we have, but are actually just there, at least in the U.S. context, to keep farmers from going out of business, but that the actual policies we need to be looking at are the free trade policies, which have encouraged globalized agriculture and sort of a race to the bottom in farming, and overproduction, which is really what causes food prices or the price of commodities to fall so low, below the cost of production in the U.S. And then the subsidies just sort of try to make the farmer whole, but they're never quite enough. So certainly I agree with Alberta that if we could, if we're going to keep that system, it's better to condition those subsidy payments on certain environmental or certain sustainable practices. But really what we need we need to change the market and have the market and economic incentives pushing farmers to not overproduce and to be more conservation minded. So in the United States, going back to the Great Depression, and the New Deal, we haven't really talked about something like a Green New Deal or a global Green New Deal, but going back to the New Deal in the United States, to deal with the farm crisis, they implemented supply management policies, which were sort of set a quota of how much would be produced. And the idea was you don't produce more than be consumed, because if you do that, and farmers, are not really coordinated, and if you're doing agriculture, you never know how much you're going to get in your field. So you just have to plant as much as you can. A factory can reduce production if prices are low to bring them back up, but a farmer can't really do that. You only get one chance, one time a year to produce, and you never know what the weather is going to be. So farmers are going to tend to overproduce, and so they need government, frankly, to come in and help manage that issue, because if they do overproduce, the price crashes, and then they go out of business. They can't pay their debts. So that's really what I would like to see us return to, this kind of more common sense approach to the issue, because the other aspect of going back to aim for climate, which we are critical of, the other issue which we didn't really mention is that it's still based in this productionist idea that we need to produce more to end hunger and to ensure food security. But the fact is, we produce, far and away, way more food than anyone can eat on the planet. And the majority of it is also going to the wealthiest countries. The global food system is still oriented towards consumers in the global north. But we don't actually, this overproduction issue is a huge problem. It's frankly, one of the drivers of the climate crisis, the ag system's contributions to the climate crisis. And so if we don't address that issue, and I don't think that we're really addressing the root causes. And so subsidies are, part of that, or like a Band-Aid to that system, but we really need to address that overproduction issue and ensure that, the prices that farmers are receiving from the marketplace and the wages that they're able to receive and pay workers and things are actually fair and represent the true cost of production. And correlate to that, that means every worker needs to be paid a fair wage that actually covers the true cost of living in a sustainable, ecological, fair, and equitable way.
What a perfect moment to finish on. That's exactly what I want to kind of build on. The question that we generally ask our interviewees when we close is, what future of agriculture are you dreaming of? And with all the kind of social structures that involves, sometimes it's easier to respond to that question just focusing on one given landscape, maybe the one that's nearest to you, or one given country as an example. Tristan, since you were just talking about something similar, do you want to build on that idea? What's a agri-food system utopia from where you're standing?
Great question. I think, living in Baltimore, Maryland, I'm not sure if the audience of this podcast is familiar with Baltimore, but, there's a lot of poverty and unemployment here. It's a deindustrialized city, port city. There's a lot of land that could be developed. And so, I'd love to see more farms, more urban farms, more parts of the suburban sprawl protected. So we don't just have development on farmland, but many more farms and many more young people and older people too, who see farming as a viable job and as a respectable job and as a job you can earn like a decent living from and get respect. Because I think there are so many people who like to live with their hands, or who like to work with their hands, who want to do practical things and who love nature. And right now, because of the way the economy is structured and the way policy is oriented, going into farming as a young person is either impossible or incredibly difficult and lonely. And that needs to change. And, we've got about 2 million farmers in the U.S., probably about 3, maybe 4 million migrant workers. All of those folks should have access to land, through a special program, so they can farm. So that every community should have a farm, or many farms. And we need, much more local. I'd love to see many more small food businesses that serve communities, that provide entrepreneurs with opportunities, and which are fair and are part of a local community economy, and which are also, needs to be said, very low carbon or zero carbon.
Alberta, what about you? What's your food system utopia?
My food system utopia is, first, that food is not conceived as a commodity. So food must be considered as value, as a culture, as a right. as a social relation. I come from Italy, so I have a really holistic vision around food. I'm also very attentive to power dynamics. So I think that food system structure, how we design food system must be really able to speak to how to restructure the power dynamic in society in order to achieve, more equity and more equality. And if we apply this to agriculture, I completely share the vision of small-scale food producers and the food sovereignty movements when they say and they claim that the control on seeds, biodiversity, land, water, knowledge, commons are put in the hands of those who produce the food that I eat, that all of us eat, and all the world eat. So I think that I would like to see small depending on the context. I know that small in Europe means something, in the US means something different, but small, family-led, local, diversified agri-food system that have stronger connection with consumers and where food is safe, healthy, fresh, and accessible. So this is my utopia for the future of food system.
Thank you both so much.
Our show is a podcast from Tascape Media, hosted by Alexandra George-Pico, who's also an assistant producer, and Theodore Simmons, who produces and edits the series. The production assistant is me, Beatrix Keeler. Alistair Simmons is our executive producer. Our thanks to all who've been involved in making the show possible.